You're invited to stand with me for the reading from the Gospel of Marc. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from the heaven, "You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by the confuser, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I have been preoccupied in these last couple of days because my beloved sister-in-law Helen had a stroke, and she was beginning to do some improving and is in intensive care unit, and she had a setback this afternoon. So, when you're filled up with a lot of things, it's not always easy to find that other space, but I'm going to invite you to help hold that with me. And we will see what this story has for us. We're with Jesus on this journey. So it was out of those baptismal waters that the heavens did tear open like a gift with Jesus. And our name is messaged on the wings of a dove, beloved. Our identity is so dramatically announced that it can never fly away from our memory. Or can it? With the naming ceremony complete, immediately we're led with Jesus into the wilderness. The tempter, the persuader, ready to persuade us exactly how to use our unique calling. Wild beasts are all around. We're up against the persuasions. Who and what persuades us now? I doubt that any of us here need to be persuaded that the mass school shooting did not have something to do with mass access to guns. We don't need to be persuaded that more responsible gun laws need to be enacted, and banishment of assault rifles would be in order. How can we have a legal drinking age of 21 and no such laws about guns? We may be reaching a tipping point, though, in this conversation, with young people leading the way. It would be tempting to make this sermon a call to action, but there are plenty of those moments available to us. You are well informed about the issues that arise from the tragic loss of lives at the Parkland School. And we will march, and we will write, and we will vote our convictions and as our convictions and our abilities compel us. But today, I offer a call to remember our identity as baptized followers of Jesus. It is the first Sunday of Lent, and we are making the journey with Jesus. Do we know of any story as compelling and powerful and timely as the Jesus story to speak to this time in our lives? My first response to hearing about another school shooting was anger. Now, anger has a good role to play in the work of injustice, and it can fuel our efforts. It is important. But anger can become an endless supply of refuelable energy that can damage our souls. When we step below the anger, there is profound grief. My word today has been informed more by my grief and my failures and my feeling of powerlessness than from my successes as one who likes to engage in persuasion. It might have been better if I hadn't had that recent conversation with an extended family member about immigration and the wall. And it certainly would have been better without that other recent conversation with another extended family member about gun laws. Needless to say, we were not persuaded to change our minds on our position. My family divide mirrors the country divide. We know how to name our convictions, although I have to say that I always wonder after some of those conversations if I could have said things more convincingly. We don't know how to trust that our different persuasions could lead us to possibilities for the common good. We have such an all or nothing way of seeing our very complicated issues that we rarely get beyond the posturing or the shouting. My conversations brought my grief right up from my belly into my throat, clear up to my tear ducts. We weep. We grieve. We lament. And here in this community, we do the best we can to do it together. We want to know how to stop the violence. And we are willing to sacrifice for that, especially when it comes to our children. After a conflict or a fight at our prison, where I served for 13 years as a chaplain, an incident report was made about the cause to how that fight broke out. You know, it's who, what, when, where, why. So as a chaplain, I wanted to know the why, so I often asked. And when one inmate slashed the throat of another, I asked, why? Why'd you do it? And his answer? Because that guy was spreading lies about me. And this is my home for the rest of my life. And I couldn't be thought weak. I had to do it for my reputation. Now I have to say that I don't think any answer could have persuaded me to say, oh yes, now I fully understand why you tried to kill him. There is no explanation that suffices. One time, 17 inmates from the United Blood Nation gang who were in solitary confinement organized an action from their cells. At the designated time, they stopped up the toilets in their cells, flooding their entire housing unit and the unit below them. The water was shut off. All the men stopped their yelling and pounding their doors except for one. And he was placed in 4-point restraints for 24 hours. So I went to visit him. I took him a prayer from his Rastafarian faith. But then I discovered that he couldn't even receive a piece of paper. So I read him the prayer. And then I asked him through that tiny trap window, why? Why'd you do it? You knew you couldn't win. He said, because they need to know we have power. And did you see how many officers it took to stop me? Does powerlessness give rise to violence? Could that be one of the explanations from last week? I imagined with this Rastafarian, I imagined that there were teachers, maybe even parents in his life who said, we don't hit people. But there are other persuasions at work in him. not the least of which is the message in our culture and what Walter Wink called our relentless belief in the myth of redemptive violence. You hit me, I'm hitting you back, and I'm going to do it as strong as I can. So how? How could he be persuaded differently? He was in a place of constant surveillance, pat-down searches, frequent lockdowns, cell searches, officers, and a controlled environment. And still, there were fights, weapons, drugs, and regular means of engaging in destructive powers. What persuades us? Years ago, I was convinced that I was not making any difference, that all my efforts were for naught. I was convinced that I had failed as a persuader. You know, preachers are persuaders. Most of us are, you know, parents, teachers, friends we try to persuade, our other friends and family and community, and hey, our legislators. We're all persuaders, but preachers, you know, have a particular kind of bent toward standing in front of a whole bunch of people and trying to persuade. So we have a lot at stake about being a persuader. We like to think that we have some controls over the community of faith. You know, for guiding conflicts and disagreements and stirring up the community to bring world peace and end world hunger. You know, so I persuaded myself that I wasn't making a difference and that I was a failure. So I resigned as a pastor. On my last day of work, I was in my office packing up my files. And I was feeling the weight of failing my church, my family, and a whole movement for women in leadership in the church. Jeez. A little outsized in imagining my power, eh? But while I was doing that, a man stopped by the office to say he wanted to see me for 5 minutes. I didn't know him. Never saw him before. I didn't want to give him any time, much less 5 minutes. But he insisted, walked in my office, sat right down in a chair, and he said, I wanted you to know that I was one of the people who said terrible things about you when you came to pastor this church 8 years ago. I thought you were defying the word of God and that you were a heretic. And I spread that word far and wide. But I've been watching your church over these years. And I've noticed all the things you've been doing in the community that are good, that show your love. He said, I slipped into a worship service late one day, and all I can tell you is this. I experienced a sense in that service of the Spirit of God's love. It changed me. So when I saw in the newspaper that you were leaving, I wanted to come tell you. I came to ask for your forgiveness and your blessing. With that, he stood up and he bowed his head. I was stunned. He'd been watching us. He'd experienced love through us. How'd this happen? You mean I'm not in control? You mean I have no clue what God is stirring up out of my sight? I have to say that I didn't feel like I had a blessing in me for anyone. But I realized that this man was not going to go anywhere without a blessing. So I put my hand on his shoulder and I said a blessing word. And I can tell you, I don't have any remembrance of what those words were. And then I bowed my head and I asked him to offer me blessing. Through tears in his eyes, he did. And I wept too. You know, I don't even remember his name. I simply call him Angel. Because he came to me in my wilderness time. And for a moment, we were both persuaded of our one true name. Beloved. Beloved of God. Friends, Jesus was persuaded by the force of God's love that held him steady against all other counter forces, which were in great evidence when he walked this earth. He gave his heart again and again and again to love, even to his disappointed and disappointing disciples, as well as to his cruel enemies. He faced the persuaders and met them with love, even at the cost of his own life. As we begin this Lenten journey, may we be persuaded again of the good news evidenced in the life and witness of Jesus, and choose to follow his radical way, come what may, through the whole kit and caboodle of failures, joys, sorrows, sufferings, setbacks, disappointments. And may the angelic forces come into our wilderness, giving us all the grace we need to bear witness to this wonderful world that is still full of the blessings of the love of God. Still.